A lot of people are worried about AI or chat, whatever the heck it is, putting people out of business. 5 years, it'll take over the world. Well, one thing it won't do away with, even if it does emerge into following it, it won't do away with storytelling. Because storytelling fulfills a basic need. It speaks to a part of our consciousness that kind of developed before language did. Images, accounts, feelings. Our stories, especially if you are a student of Joseph Campbell, our stories always follow a certain pattern. There's a format. There is a premise. Person comes from very lowly circumstances, goes through a series of adventures, becomes transformed. Now, along the way, there's usually a mentor figure, close friend, sidekick, confidant. There's a traitor. There's a villain. There's always an obstacle that has to be encountered. And it's not just men, because if you look at the Greek myths and the Norse myths and the Celtic myths and everything else, you can see all the guys that have to go out and perform these great feats. But there were also things like that went along with the feminine side. You have Snow White, you have Cinderella, you have Rapunzel, you have Belle from Beauty and the Beast. Our stories basically talk about how we have to grow and develop. They feed us. They reinforce us. They help perpetuate our values. Usually, one way or another, all the stories that we have heard from the time we gathered around campfires underneath the stars to sitting in our living room watching Netflix, streaming The Mandalorian. Somehow, all of these stories have morphed, shape-shifted, transformed into something relevant to each person, each generation, each era, each phase of our history, where we will take an ordinary person and we will transform them into something extraordinary. George Washington was so highly regarded that he was almost deified in American folklore. He never told a lie. He was able to throw $1 across the Potomac. He never set a foot wrong. The historical accounts probably differ a little bit, but when we had the American Revolution, we didn't just cut ourselves off from the British government. We cut ourselves off from our British heritage. In England, you had Richard the Lionheart. You had King Arthur. You had Strongbow. You had all these figures that spoke to their national identity, imparted their values. They had their own mythology. After 1776, we defined ourselves as Americans. What was an American? Not an Englishman. Guy Fawkes Day was gone. We didn't celebrate the King's birthday as a public holiday anymore. We had this big gap. We needed to fill it. We had a psychological need to fill this. So we have populated it ever since then with characters from our history. George Washington being really the first one that we mythologized. Then we realized that we had put him kind of out of the reach of the average American. So the whole symbolism of the log cabin, emerging from a log cabin, humble beginnings, and building yourself up and making yourself into something. That started with some of the presidential elections in the early 1800s. We had something tailor-made for that. We had somebody who really did come from a log cabin. Very humble beginnings, Abraham Lincoln. He went on to become leader of the United States in one of the most trying times in our history. Barely saw the success of all his actions when he was suddenly struck down by an assassin. American hero and tragedy. Perfect for our mythology. Then you have the opening of the Wild West. You have the cowboy, you have the pioneers. Yes, you have the bandits, the train robbers. You have the Indian chiefs, which also factor into uniquely American mythology. But in the end, these are all things that have helped us tell our story, write our story, become our story, give us icons and symbols and ideals to live up to. Maybe later on we realize that some of those ideals were not necessarily ideals, and it involves us rethinking and relooking. But then when we realize that perhaps some of our earlier subjects are flawed, we start looking for new ones. Storytelling is all about our search to find out about ourselves. That's what it's there for. That's why it's never going to go away, because it always needs to be there. We always need a definition. We always need an ideal to aspire to. We always need a hero or a heroine. We always need something to say, I want to be like that when I grow up. And in trying to become like that, we usually find ourselves along the way, which is the other purpose behind storytelling. So whether it's your grandfather bouncing you on his knee, your grandmother going through the family albums, old folks telling you stories about when they grew up and local characters and this, that, and the other thing, somebody passing on an urban legend or a ghost story, somewhere along the way, you're always going to get a story, something to teach you a lesson, something to pass on some bit of information, something to pass on your heritage, something to help you define yourself. So, your story is being written. What's it going to be? Mine, going for an adventure with a little bit of comedy thrown in.